News. Come November, Nebraskans will decide the fate of medical marijuana. Secretary of State Bob Evnen officially certifying two measures today amid heavy scrutiny.
6 News' Philip Katafamo joins us in studio with what's next.
Aaron and Jacqueline, Nebraskans for Medical Marijuana is celebrating today's certification of its two petitions. One of the measures would allow patients to purchase medical marijuana. The other would allow businesses to sell it. Secretary Evnen says both met the requirement of at least 5% of registered voter signatures in 52 counties. He says his office did not receive any requests from individuals to take their signatures off either measure.
Our counties, in a 40-day period of time, were required to verify upwards of 600,000 signatures. And I want to say that the counties did a remarkable job. They did a remarkable job of confirming the validity of the signatures that they found to be valid. And of course, there are also signatures that they found to not be valid.
Certification came hours after the state attorney general and Hall County attorney Martin Klein announced an investigation into fraudulent signatures on both measures. They say petition circulator Michael Egbert of Grand Island is charged with falsifying signatures. If convicted, Egbert could serve a maximum of 2 years in prison and or a fine of up to $10,000.
Mr. Egbert did acknowledge that he had at times left those signature pages alone as he had gone to the restroom or gone to break. He had in fact written names down, gone out into a phone book and got names of individuals with addresses here in the Grand Island, Hall County area. And then he did on occasion sign those names himself. The voter didn't sign them.
Now, if more fraudulent signatures are found ahead of the November election, it could terminate the measures from the ballot. A lawsuit was also filed in Lancaster County yesterday, alleging other fraud. We've learned today that hearing is postponed and has not been rescheduled at this time. On your side, Philip Katafamo, 6 News, back to you.